January 1944, a foggy morning over the industrial heart of Germany. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning coal and diesel. Below the towering smokestacks of the Krupp factories, the rhythmic hum of machinery was a constant sound, almost a lullaby to the workers who toiled day and night to fuel the Nazi war machine. But that morning, as the first faint light of day glinted off the blackened steel, something unusual happened. On the other side of the world, thousands of miles away, an invisible force was shifting the balance of power. A force so powerful, its very existence seemed impossible to the enemy. It began with the machines. In the dark waters of the Atlantic, American submarines had been cutting the lifelines of the Axis for months, devastating the supply routes that kept German factories alive. But in 1944, another unseen weapon began to take shape. An industrial powerhouse that would outproduce and outlast anything Germany could comprehend. The speed with which the United States had mobilized its war production seemed to defy logic. In a country still reeling from the Great Depression just a few years earlier, America's factories now churned out tanks, planes, and guns faster than the Germans could even process the numbers. In Germany, the high command was desperate. They knew they were losing the war on multiple fronts, but the industrial output of the Allies seemed to be an impossible problem. The Nazis had prepared for a long war, but they had never anticipated the sheer scale and speed of American production. The propaganda machine in Berlin couldn't hide the fear creeping into the ranks of the Wehrmacht. On paper, the Allies had already produced more than 75,000 tanks in 1943 alone. The German industry, which had once been the most advanced in Europe, was now scrambling to keep up. The numbers were incomprehensible. 500,000 trucks, thousands of bombers, and millions of tons of ammunition. The scale of production coming out of the United States seemed not just impossible, but supernatural. Behind this explosion of output was the mother plant, the sprawling network of factories and refineries designed to supply everything needed for war. The American war machine's mother plant model was the brainchild of a network of engineers, logistics experts, and a singular vision to outproduce the Axis at an unprecedented speed. The plants themselves were a marvel of engineering, sprawling complexes capable of shifting production priorities overnight. In the heart of Michigan, the Detroit arsenal churned out tanks at a rate that made German engineers shake their heads in disbelief. A single factory in Detroit could produce a new tank every 63 minutes. In comparison, Germany's best factories required months to finish even a fraction of that. Germany's response was panic. They simply couldn't fathom how a nation could shift gears so quickly, creating vast quantities of military goods at the drop of a hat. The Germans had optimized their industrial production over years, but they lacked the American capacity for reinvention and sheer volume. As reports flooded into Berlin about the scale of American production, the German war machine stumbled. Factory managers in Hamburg and Berlin couldn't believe the speed at which their American counterparts were scaling up production. The Allied numbers were too staggering. The Americans weren't just building planes and tanks. They were constructing entire ecosystems of supply. Fuel, rubber, and metal were now flowing into the factories of the United States at a pace that Germany could never have anticipated. On the front lines, the impact of this industrial revolution was felt in every battle. The Allied forces, equipped with the fruits of this mother plant network, were sweeping across the European continent. Tanks rolled through France, artillery thundered in Italy, and bombers filled the skies. The Germans could only watch in horror as their formidable panzer divisions, once the envy of the world, were overwhelmed by American armor that seemed to have an endless supply of fuel and firepower. The Germans could no longer keep up with the rate at which the Allies replaced their losses. But it wasn't just the scale of production that left the Germans in disbelief. It was the speed. In Berlin, Hermann Göring's Reich Ministry of Aviation had once been the jewel of Nazi industry. Yet when compared to the American war production system, it became painfully clear how far behind Germany was. The United States was able to build entire factories from scratch and turn them into highly efficient production centers in a matter of months. The B-17 bomber, the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force, could be produced in vast numbers at Boeing's plant in Seattle. While Germany struggled to build aircraft that could keep pace with Allied bombers, the United States was filling the skies with thousands of them. One of the most astounding feats of American industry was the sheer versatility of the plants. By late 1944, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan had become a symbol of American industrial might. The factory was originally designed to build B-24 Liberator bombers, but its size and capacity allowed it to switch production to tanks, trucks, and even aircraft engines. This level of adaptability was unheard of in Germany, where factory lines were rigidly tailored to specific products. To the Germans, the American ability to scale up and adapt was an existential threat. As the war dragged on, German leaders became more and more desperate. In response to the mounting pressure, they attempted to create their own mother plants and expanded their own industrial capabilities. But it was too late. They had missed the window. The speed of American production had already turned the tide of the war. By 1944, the Allies were producing more military equipment than Germany could possibly destroy. The German generals knew that no matter how many resources they threw into the war, the Americans had the ability to replace every tank, every truck, and every plane they lost. In the darkened boardrooms of Nazi industry, the fear was palpable. The tide had shifted. The Germans had no answer for the unstoppable wave of American production. Even the mighty Wehrmacht couldn't withstand the barrage of American military might that flowed from the factories. The sheer scale and speed of American production were more than just overwhelming. They were the final nails in Germany's coffin. And as the Allies closed in on Berlin, the remnants of the once mighty Nazi war machine were left in ruins, unable to match the relentless tide of American industry. The world would soon see that it wasn't just the bombs and bullets that had won the war. It was the relentless, unstoppable force of American production. In the heart of the American factories, the workers had unknowingly forged the future of warfare, changing the course of history forever. And as Berlin burned, the world understood one simple truth. German industry couldn't believe the speed of American mother plant production. The answer was clear. It was not just about fighting wars anymore. It was about who could build the future the fastest. The secret to America's incredible industrial output lay not just in its factories, but in the advanced technologies and logistical innovations that powered them. Behind the roar of machines and the hum of assembly lines, a revolution in production was taking place. One that would fundamentally change the nature of warfare. The Germans, despite their legendary precision and engineering prowess, could not comprehend the scale of American ingenuity. They believed they were at the pinnacle of industrial efficiency, but they had not anticipated the sheer volume of innovation that would flow from the United States in 1944. At the heart of this production, miracle was the concept of mass manufacturing, something that had been perfected by American engineers long before the war began. It wasn't just about making weapons. It was about making weapons in such quantities and at such speed that the enemy could never hope to keep up. In Detroit, engineers at the Ford Motor Company had long embraced the principles of the assembly line. Henry Ford's assembly line, designed for the mass production of automobiles, would soon become the blueprint for mass production of war materials. It wasn't just about efficiency. It was about transforming an entire factory in a matter of weeks. In early 1942, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan was transformed into one of the most prolific war production facilities the world had ever seen. Initially built to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers, the factory's production capacity was staggering. By late 1943, it was producing one bomber every 63 minutes, faster than any aircraft manufacturer had ever dreamed possible. In total, the Willow Run plant would produce over 8,600 B-24 bombers before the war's end. But the real achievement wasn't just in the numbers. It was in how quickly the factory could retool. The Americans were able to pivot from producing bombers to tanks, trucks, and artillery without missing a beat. The Germans could hardly believe it. The German war machine, for all its precision and effectiveness, was hampered by an inherent rigidity in its production processes. Factories in Germany were highly specialized, often focusing on one type of weapon or vehicle. The German army's factories were designed for a specific purpose: to produce tanks, planes, and ammunition in relatively small numbers. Each factory was a fortress of its own, built for one job and one job only. When the need arose to ramp up production, it was like trying to move a massive lumbering beast. The Germans simply couldn't adapt at the pace the Allies could. In contrast, American factories operated on the principle of flexibility. When one plant was tasked with producing tanks, it could shift to producing airplanes the next day without skipping a beat. Engineers like Albert Kahn, often referred to as the architect of mass production, were able to design factories that were adaptable and scalable, able to meet the demands of war on an unprecedented level. The assembly lines could be reconfigured to build anything from trucks to tanks to aircraft parts, often in the same day. By the time the Germans were scrambling to adjust their own industrial capabilities, the Americans had already surpassed them in terms of scale and speed. But it wasn't just the assembly line that gave the Allies an advantage. It was the new technologies that enabled them to optimize production. One such breakthrough came in the form of refrigeration and air conditioning technology. The Carrier Corporation, which had pioneered modern refrigeration systems, played a critical role in keeping the factory environments cool, even in the sweltering summer months. These cooling systems kept the machinery running at optimal temperatures, ensuring that production never slowed. For the Germans, whose factories often faced logistical challenges with temperature fluctuations, this was an insurmountable problem. American engineers also turned their attention to supply chains. The Allies built a logistics network that was unrivaled in its scale and efficiency. They developed a system where raw materials and finished goods could move through the factory lines with incredible speed. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps set up an intricate system of supply depots, railways, and roads that ensured no factory ran out of raw materials. The Germans, by contrast, were often hampered by the breakdowns in their supply chains. Bombing raids on key infrastructure, particularly rail lines, disrupted German deliveries, leaving their factories without the necessary resources to continue production. But the real turning point came with the introduction of a technology that would change the course of the war: radar. While the Germans had been the pioneers of radar technology, they were slow to recognize its true potential in industrial applications. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, quickly adapted radar for tactical use, enabling them to track enemy planes and ships with unparalleled accuracy. But it was in the factory that radar technology truly showed its value. Using radar, factories could synchronize production to unprecedented levels. Workers on assembly lines could now use radio signals to communicate with one another and track the movement of parts and materials. This allowed factories to operate with maximum efficiency, even when the workforce was reduced or scattered due to air raids. In addition to these technological advancements, the American war effort was also driven by a massive increase in manpower. By 1943, the United States had employed millions of workers in factories, many of them women who had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The famous Rosie the Riveter image became a symbol of this transformation. Women in overalls, working with precision and strength, producing the weapons and machinery that would eventually bring victory to the Allies. German factories, on the other hand, were still largely reliant on male workers, and many of their best laborers had been sent to the front lines. This shortage of skilled labor compounded the difficulties that German industry was facing, as they could not maintain production at the same pace as the United States. As American production numbers skyrocketed, the Germans watched in disbelief. They had once believed that their advanced technology, their better-trained workers, and their more efficient factories would give them the edge in the war. But by late 1944, it was clear that their assumptions were wrong. Every time they struck at the Allied supply lines, the Americans would simply replace what was lost. The Germans had underestimated the power of American industry. Their own industries were simply too small and too rigid to match the volume and flexibility of the Allied war machine. The war production statistics told the story. By the end of 1944, the United States had produced more than 10,000 bombers, 45,000 tanks, and 100,000 jeeps. Germany, by contrast, had only managed to produce around 6,000 tanks that year. As the war continued, the disparity between the two nations' industrial outputs became insurmountable. The American factories, the mother plants, had already secured victory. And as the Allies closed in on Berlin, the reality of the situation became clear. The speed and scale of American production had outstripped Germany's ability to fight back. The Germans had once prided themselves on their industrial superiority, but it was the Americans, those seemingly overfed industrialists, that had delivered the final blow. The true scale of American production's impact on the war was felt not just in the weapons themselves, but in the psyche of both the Allies and the Axis. For the Germans, the realization that their industrial might could be surpassed was a devastating blow, not just to their war effort, but to their very identity. The myth of German efficiency, of an industrial machine that could outproduce the world, crumbled under the weight of American ingenuity. The result was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological collapse that would reverberate long after the war ended. In the German High Command, the toll of this realization was evident. In 1944, a German officer's diary entry read, "We fight not just for victory, but for survival, against an enemy who can replace everything we destroy. No matter how many tanks we destroy, they are already making 10 more." The slow realization that Germany could not outproduce the Allies brought an air of resignation among the officers. Where once they believed that technological superiority could win the war, they now saw it was a numbers game they could never win. Germany's industrial machine, while efficient, was not flexible enough to adapt to the speed at which the Allies could shift gears and adapt to battlefield conditions. Every strike they made against American supply lines, every factory they bombed, seemed to only make the enemy stronger. The result was a complete collapse of morale among German forces on the front lines. Soldiers began to lose faith in their commanders, in the promise of victory, and in the ideology that had once motivated them. A German Wehrmacht officer, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, later recalled in an interrogation, "We were fighting against an enemy that could replace everything we lost, faster than we could destroy it. It was like chasing shadows." The psychological impact of knowing that the enemy could keep feeding its war machine was profound. The once proud German fighting spirit, built on the idea of superior technology and military genius, faltered under the weight of an industrial behemoth they could not match. Meanwhile, the Allied forces, particularly the Americans, found renewed confidence in the unyielding supply lines that fed their armies. The vast scale of production was not just about the hardware, it was about a belief in their ability to continue fighting, no matter how intense the battles became. The ability to replace lost tanks, trucks, and aircraft allowed the Allies to adopt a strategy of attrition, a strategy they had long avoided due to the fear of running out of resources. Now, with seemingly endless supplies at their disposal, they could afford to take losses, knowing that they would always be replenished. This gave them an edge not just in battle but in strategy. Their doctrine shifted from defense to offense, knowing that as long as the factories kept running, their forces would never be overwhelmed. The psychological effect of American industrial production extended beyond the battlefield. Back home in the United States, the factories became symbols of hope, not just for the soldiers fighting overseas, but for the civilian population who saw their work as part of a greater war effort. Factories like Ford's Willow Run plant, the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, and the vast shipyards of California became symbols of American resilience and unity. The war effort was no longer a distant conflict fought by men in uniform. It was a shared responsibility that connected every American, from factory workers to soldiers, in a common cause. For the first time in history, the concept of a total war economy became a reality. The idea that a nation's industrial capacity could determine the course of the war was no longer just theoretical. It was playing out on a global stage. American workers, including the famous Rosie the Riveters, became the unsung heroes of the war. Their ability to produce weapons, ammunition, and vehicles at a pace never before seen in history made victory possible. The transformation of American industry was not just a product of technology. It was a product of a nation's willpower. The American people were united behind a cause that transcended borders and battle lines. But the story of American production didn't just end with the victory in Europe. The war had taught the world a crucial lesson about the nature of industrial warfare. The speed and scale at which the United States had mobilized its war machine would lay the foundation for post-war economic policy and military strategy. The concept of industrial warfare would be incorporated into Cold War doctrines, where the ability to outproduce an enemy became just as important as military strategy itself. In the coming decades, the lessons learned from World War II would shape the way nations viewed their industrial capacity, both as a tool of war and a tool of peace. The lessons of American production also resonated in Germany, though not in the way the Nazis had hoped. After the war, German industry would undergo a miraculous recovery, but this time, it would be built on the principles of American production. The famed Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, of the 1950s, saw German industry adopt many of the same practices that had been employed by the Americans during the war. The legacy of American industrialization was felt not just in the military triumphs of 1945, but in the way the world would rebuild in the post-war years. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the final German resistance crumbled in the face of overwhelming Allied production. Berlin fell, the factories ceased their production, and the dream of Nazi domination faded into history. The world had seen the last of Germany's industrial might and had witnessed the rise of a new, unstoppable force: the American industrial juggernaut. The story of how American production changed the course of the war is not just one of machines and factories. It is a story of human perseverance, innovation, and unity. The sheer scale of what was achieved by American industry during World War II has never been matched, and the legacy of that achievement lives on in the way nations today view their industrial capacity. The Germans had believed that the war could be won through technological superiority, but in the end, it was the American ability to adapt, to produce, and to outlast that made all the difference. The speed of American mother plant production became the defining factor in the war, a factor so overwhelming that the Germans could never comprehend it. The war was won not just by tanks and planes, but by the factories that made them. As Berlin burned and the Nazi regime crumbled, one thing was clear. The true victor of World War II was the unrelenting power of American industry. The mother plant production machine that had fueled the Allies to victory and shattered the German war effort forever.